The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Raven's Hollow Palace like secrets refusing to be told. Prince Alexander stood at his study window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens that had bloomed for 3 centuries. At 35, he carried the weight of tradition on his shoulders, though today that weight felt heavier than usual. Alexander had always known the palace held secrets. Every old building did, especially one that had housed the Ashford royal family for generations, but he never expected to find what lay hidden beneath the very foundations of his childhood home. It started with the renovation project. Queen Mother Isabel had insisted that the East Wing needed updating. New plumbing, fresh wiring, modern conveniences disguised within historical charm. Alexander had reluctantly agreed, knowing that his stepmother usually got her way. She had married his father, King Edmund, when Alexander was 15, just 2 years after his mother's death in that terrible riding accident. The construction crew had been working for 3 weeks when foreman Marcus Webb came to Alexander's office with an expression that mixed excitement and concern. Marcus was a seasoned professional who had worked on several heritage buildings, but something about his demeanor that Tuesday morning made Alexander set down his morning tea and give the man his full attention.
"Your Highness," Marcus began, his weathered hands clutching a hard hat, "we've discovered something unusual. When we were installing the new electrical systems in the East Wing basement, we found what appears to be a concealed entrance."
Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Concealed entrance?" "Behind a false wall, sir. Looks like it's been there for decades, maybe longer. The stonework is old, but the concealment appears more recent. We found it when we had to remove some of the newer paneling." The prince felt a familiar flutter of curiosity that had gotten him into trouble as a boy. His father used to scold him for exploring every nook and cranny of the palace, but Alexander had never been able to resist a mystery. "Show me," he said, rising from his desk. They walked through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead kings and queens, their painted eyes seeming to follow Alexander's movement. The East Wing had been his mother's favorite part of the palace. She had spent countless hours in the morning room there, reading or working on her correspondence. After her death, his father had largely abandoned that section, and it had fallen into gentle disuse. The basement beneath the East Wing was a maze of storage rooms and servant quarters from bygone eras. Electric lights had been strung along the ceiling for the renovation work, casting harsh shadows on stone walls that had stood since the palace's construction in 1642. Marcus led him to a section where the workers had been installing new electrical panels. A section of what had appeared to be solid stone wall had been removed, revealing an opening just wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. "We haven't gone through," Marcus said. "Thought you should know first." Alexander peered into the darkness beyond the opening. Cool air flowed from the hidden space, carrying a musty scent that spoke of long years without sunlight. He pulled out his phone's flashlight and aimed the beam into the gap. The light revealed a narrow corridor stretching into blackness, its walls lined with the same gray stone as the rest of the palace foundations. But this passage had clearly been designed to remain hidden. "Have you told anyone else about this?" Alexander asked. "Just my immediate crew, sir. The 3 men who were working on this section. I told them to keep it quiet until you could see it." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Let's keep it that way for now. I want to explore this myself before we decide how to proceed." Marcus looked uncertain. "Begging your pardon, Your Highness, but shouldn't we have security check it first? We don't know where it leads or what condition it's in." "You're probably right," Alexander admitted, though every instinct urged him to squeeze through that gap immediately. "But I want to keep this quiet. Too many people knowing about hidden passages in the royal residence." Well, you can imagine the security implications. That evening, after the construction crew had gone home, Alexander returned to the basement with Captain James Morrison, the head of palace security. James had served the royal family for 15 years and was one of the few people Alexander trusted completely. James examined the opening with a professional eye, testing the stability of the stone around the entrance and shining a powerful flashlight down the corridor. "It's definitely old construction," James observed, "but someone went to considerable trouble to hide it. The false wall that concealed it was built much later, probably sometime in the last 50 years based on the materials. Any idea why someone would want to hide a passage that was already hidden? That's what worries me, sir. Hidden passages in old buildings aren't unusual. They were often built for quick escapes during times of war or political upheaval. But actively concealing one that already exists, that suggests someone was using it for something they didn't want discovered. Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. Are you suggesting someone in the royal household was using this passage recently? I'm not suggesting anything yet, Your Highness, but I think we need to find out where this leads before we draw any conclusions. They squeezed through the opening, James leading with his flashlight and Alexander following. The passage was narrow but well constructed, with a slightly arched ceiling that suggested medieval craftsmanship. Their footsteps echoed softly off the stone walls as they moved deeper underground. After about 50 meters, the passage began to slope upward. They reached a set of stone steps, worn smooth by countless feet over the centuries. At the top of the steps, they found another concealed entrance, this one hidden behind what appeared to be a bookshelf. James examined the mechanism. This is definitely modern work. Someone installed a pivot system here. Very professional, very discreet. He found the hidden lever and the bookshelf swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a room that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. They were in Queen Mother Isabel's private study. The room was elegant and precisely arranged, with antique furniture and carefully chosen artwork. Alexander had been here many times over the years, usually for formal meetings or family discussions, but he had never suspected that it connected to a secret passage. This doesn't make sense, Alexander said, looking around the familiar room with new eyes. Why would Isabel need a secret passage to the East Wing basement? James was examining the bookshelf mechanism from the inside. Someone's been using this regularly, sir. The hinges are well oiled, the mechanism works smoothly. This isn't some forgotten historical curiosity. A terrible possibility began to form in Alexander's mind. The East Wing basement connected to storage areas where the palace kept historical documents, family records, and other sensitive materials. His mother's personal papers were stored there, along with various items from her apartments that his father couldn't bear to have around after her death. James, he said slowly, I need you to check something for me, discreetly. I want to know if anyone has been accessing the storage areas in the East Wing basement. Check the security logs, talk to the staff who have access, but don't let anyone know what we've found here. Of course, sir. May I ask what you're thinking? Alexander looked at the bookshelf entrance, now closed and invisible again from this side. I'm thinking that someone has been using this passage to access areas they're not supposed to access. And given where it leads, I'm worried about what they might have been looking for. The next 3 days passed slowly as James conducted his investigation. Alexander tried to maintain his normal routine, but he found his mind constantly returning to the hidden passage and its implications. He watched Queen Mother Isabel during their daily interactions, looking for any sign of guilt or nervousness. She seemed perfectly normal. Gracious, intelligent, slightly formal as always. If she was hiding something, she was very good at it. On Friday morning, James requested a private meeting in Alexander's study. His expression was grave as he closed the door behind him. I've completed the preliminary investigation, sir. You're not going to like what I found. Alexander gestured for him to sit. Tell me. The security logs show multiple unauthorized entries to the East Wing basement storage areas over the past 2 years. Always late at night. Always during periods when the regular security rounds were predictably elsewhere. Do we know who? The entries correlate with times when Queen Mother Isabel was in the palace and had dismissed her personal protection detail for the evening. Someone with intimate knowledge of palace security protocols and access to her private study. Alexander felt a sick certainty settling in his stomach. What's in those storage areas that someone might want? That's where it gets more complicated, sir. I had archives do a discreet inventory check. Several boxes of documents related to your mother's death are missing. Police reports, medical examiner findings, correspondence from the investigation period. Also missing are some personal items from your mother's rooms. Jewelry, personal letters, her writing equipment. The room seemed to spin slightly. Alexander gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process what James was telling him. You're saying that Isabel has been stealing documents and personal items related to my mother's death? I'm saying that someone with access to her private study and detailed knowledge of palace security has been systematically removing materials related to the late Queen's death. Whether that's Queen Mother Isabel herself or someone she's working with, that's what we need to determine. Alexander stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens where his mother used to walk every morning. 20 years had passed since that terrible day when her horse had thrown her during what should have been a routine ride. The investigation had been thorough. Accidents happened, even to expert riders. There had been no suggestion of foul play, until now. James, I need you to set up surveillance on that passage. I want to know if it's being used again. But do it quietly. If Isabel is involved, I don't want her to know we're onto her yet. Already in progress, sir. I've installed motion-activated cameras at both ends of the passage. If anyone uses it, we'll know. Good. And James? I want you to start looking into my mother's death again, quietly. Review everything. The police reports, the medical examiner's findings, witness statements. If someone is trying to hide evidence about what really happened that day, I need to know. That weekend, Alexander found himself studying Queen Mother Isabel with new eyes during their family dinner. She was telling an amusing story about a diplomatic reception she had attended. Her laugh musical and seemingly genuine. She had always been charming, always perfectly appropriate for her role. His father had been desperately lonely after his first wife's death, and Isabel had brought light back into his life. But now Alexander wondered what else she might have brought. After dinner, as they sat in the drawing room with coffee, Isabel mentioned the renovation work in the East Wing. I do hope they're being careful with the historical integrity of that section, she said, stirring her coffee delicately. Your dear mother loved that part of the palace so much, I'd hate for any of her favorite spaces to be damaged. They're being very careful, Alexander assured her, watching her face for any reaction. Though they have discovered some interesting historical features. Apparently, the palace has more hidden passages than we realized. For just a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, but her smile never wavered. How fascinating, she said. These old palaces are full of secrets, aren't they? Sometimes I think the stones themselves hold memories. Later that night, Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling of his bedroom. The palace around him creaked and settled, as old buildings do, but tonight, every sound seemed ominous. Somewhere in these walls, a passage connected his stepmother's study to the basement where his mother's belongings had been stored. Someone had been systematically removing evidence related to his mother's death. The question that haunted him was why. What secret was worth 20 years of careful, methodical theft? What truth about that terrible riding accident was someone so desperate to hide? As he finally drifted off to sleep, Alexander's last conscious thought was a resolution. Whatever the truth was, whatever the cost, he was going to find it. The next morning brought news that would change everything. James appeared at Alexander's door before breakfast, his face pale and urgent. Sir, you need to see this immediately. The surveillance camera caught something last night. They hurried to James's security office, where multiple monitors displayed feeds from cameras throughout the palace. James pulled up a recording from the previous evening, timestamp showing 2:47 a.m. The screen showed the bookshelf entrance to the hidden passage, illuminated by infrared cameras. At first, nothing moved. Then the shelf began to swing inward. A figure emerged from the passage, someone wearing dark clothes and moving with practiced stealth. The person paused, looked around the room, then walked to a filing cabinet in the corner. They withdrew something from their jacket and began working on the cabinet's lock. Can you enhance the image? Alexander asked, his heart pounding. James worked the controls, zooming in on the figure's face. Queen Mother Isabel looked directly into the camera for one clear, unmistakable moment. Alexander felt the world shift beneath his feet. 20 years of trust, of family bonds, of believing in the woman his father had loved, all of it crumbled in an instant. What is she looking for? He whispered. That's what we need to find out, sir. But I think it's safe to say that your mother's death wasn't the accident everyone believed it to be. As Alexander stared at the frozen image of Isabel's face on the monitor, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his family, about his mother's death, about the woman who had helped raise him, all of it had been a carefully constructed lie. And now, finally, it was time to uncover the truth. The revelation that Queen Mother Isabel had been using the hidden passage sent shockwaves through Alexander's carefully ordered world. For 3 days, he struggled to maintain his composure during their daily interactions. while inside his mind raced with questions and terrible possibilities. Captain Morrison had enhanced the security footage and confirmed what they both feared. This wasn't an isolated incident. The motion sensors showed that Isabel had been using the passage regularly for months, always in the early hours of the morning when the palace was quiet and the regular security rounds were predictable. She's been at this for a long time, James reported during their private meeting on Wednesday morning. The timestamps show entries going back at least 8 months, and those are just since we installed the current monitoring system. Given the wear patterns on the passage mechanism, I'd estimate she's been using it for years. Alexander paced his study, his mind churning with implications. Have you found out what she was looking for in the filing cabinet? That cabinet contained personal correspondence from the period around your mother's death, letters between your father and various officials, private communications with the family's legal team, even some personal notes your mother had written in the days before the accident. The word accident hung in the air between them, loaded with new meaning. James, I need you to accelerate the investigation into my mother's death. I don't care what resources it takes. If there's something to find, I want it found. Already underway, sir. I've been working with a private investigation firm, completely discreet, no connection to palace security. They're reviewing everything. The accident scene, witness statements, your mother's activities in the weeks before her death, even the condition of her horse and riding equipment. Alexander stopped pacing and looked out the window toward the stables where his mother used to ride every morning. Queen Arabella had been an accomplished equestrian, having ridden since childhood. The official investigation concluded that her horse had been spooked by something, a rabbit perhaps, or a sudden noise, and had thrown her against a tree. Her injuries had been severe and immediate. She died before help could reach her. What about the missing documents? Do we know specifically what Isabel took? James consulted his notes. The inventory is still incomplete, but we can confirm that several key items are missing. The original police report, which should have been returned to the Royal Archives after the investigation, the veterinary examination of your mother's horse, and, most significantly, your mother's personal diary from the 6 months before her death. Alexander felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. My mother kept a diary? Apparently so. According to the archival records, it was among her personal effects. A leather-bound book where she recorded her daily thoughts and observations. The archivist noted it specifically because your mother had written in it the very morning of her death. The implications were staggering. If his mother had suspected something, if she had recorded concerns or fears in her diary, it would explain why someone might be desperate to keep it hidden. Sir, James continued carefully, there's something else. I had the team look into Queen Mother Isabel's background again, going deeper than the standard security clearance review that was done when she married your father. What did you find? Her first marriage, to Count Victor Brennan, ended under suspicious circumstances. The Count died in what was ruled a hunting accident, just 6 months before Isabel met your father. She inherited his entire estate, which was considerable. Alexander sank into his chair, feeling the weight of this revelation. You're suggesting that Isabel has done this before? I'm suggesting that we have a pattern. 2 deaths, both ruled accidental, both involving spouses who left significant inheritances. In your mother's case, her death cleared the way for Isabel to marry your father and become Queen Mother. The room was silent except for the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock that had belonged to Alexander's great-grandfather. He tried to process what James was telling him, but it seemed impossible. Isabel had been part of his life for 20 years. She had comforted him when he struggled with the loss of his mother, had helped guide him through his education and early royal duties. Could she really be a calculating murderer who had orchestrated his mother's death? I need proof, Alexander said finally. Solid, undeniable proof. Whatever Isabel has been hiding in those stolen documents, I need to know what it is. That might be difficult, sir. If she's smart, and she clearly is, she's probably destroyed anything truly damaging by now, maybe. But people who have gotten away with crimes for 20 years sometimes become overconfident. They keep trophies, souvenirs, evidence of their victories. If Isabel killed my mother, there has to be something she kept that proves it. James nodded thoughtfully. What do you want to do? I want to search her private rooms, tonight when she's attending the charity gala at the Pemberton Hotel. She'll be gone for hours, and most of the staff will be with her. Sir, that's extremely risky. If she discovers that you know about the passage, about her activities, then we'll have to be very careful not to get caught. That evening, Alexander watched from his window as Queen Mother Isabel's motorcade departed for the charity gala. She looked elegant and composed, wearing a deep blue gown and the diamond necklace that had once belonged to Alexander's grandmother. To any observer, she was the perfect picture of royal dignity. But Alexander now saw something else in her careful composure. The practiced control of someone who had been living a lie for decades. At 11 p.m., when the palace had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Alexander and James made their way to Isabel's private apartments. James had disabled the security cameras in the corridor, ensuring their presence would go unrecorded. Isabel's suite was a study in refined elegance. Antique furniture, carefully chosen artwork, fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. Everything was perfectly placed, perfectly maintained. It was the living space of someone who paid attention to every detail. "Where do we start?" Alexander whispered, though there was no one to overhear them. "People hide important things in places that feel secure to them," James replied, pulling on latex gloves. "Usually somewhere they can access easily, but that wouldn't be obvious to casual observation." They began with her study, carefully examining the desk drawers and filing cabinets. Most of what they found was exactly what one would expect: correspondence, appointment schedules, charitable organization documents. But in the bottom drawer of an antique secretary desk, James found something interesting. "Sir, look at this." It was a key, ornate and old-fashioned, unlike any of the modern palace keys. Attached to it was a small tag with numbers written in Isabel's precise handwriting. SDB 347. Safety Deposit Box. Alexander realized she has a private safety deposit box that's not in any of the official financial records. They searched more carefully, looking for any indication of which bank might house Box 347. In a leather portfolio hidden behind a row of books, James found what they were looking for: statements from the First National Bank of Edinburgh, showing monthly rental payments for a safety deposit box. "This is it," Alexander said, examining the statements. "The payments go back 15 years. Whatever she's been hiding, it's in that box." They were about to leave when Alexander noticed something that made him freeze. On Isabel's dressing table, among her jewelry and personal items, sat a small silver frame containing a photograph. It showed Isabel on horseback, smiling at the camera. She was wearing riding attire and sitting on a beautiful chestnut mare, the same breed as his mother's horse, the same color. In fact, the more Alexander looked at it, the more certain he became that it was the same horse. "James," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "look at this photograph. That's definitely your mother's horse. Duchess, wasn't that her name?"
Yes.
"But this photo was taken after my mother's death. Look at Isabel. She's older here than she was when she first married my father. This was taken years later. Why would she be riding your mother's horse?" A terrible possibility occurred to Alexander. What if the horse didn't spook that morning? What if it was trained to respond to specific commands, specific signals? What if someone who knew horses very well had spent time conditioning it to react in a certain way at a certain moment? The implications were chilling. If Isabel had somehow trained his mother's horse to throw her rider at a specific location, at a specific time, it would explain how she could have orchestrated the murder while maintaining an alibi. She could have been miles away when the accident occurred, secure in the knowledge that the horse would do exactly what she had trained it to do. "We need to get to that safety deposit box," Alexander said. "Whatever evidence she's been hiding, it's there." "Sir, we can't just walk into a bank and demand access to someone else's safety deposit box." "No, but I can have my legal team obtain a court order. As the heir to the throne, I have certain privileges when it comes to investigating potential crimes against the royal family." They were preparing to leave when they heard the sound of cars in the courtyard below. Alexander looked out the window and saw Isabel's motorcade returning. "She's back early," he hissed. "The gala isn't supposed to end for another hour." They could hear voices in the hallway, growing closer. Isabel's voice, speaking to her lady-in-waiting, complaining of a sudden headache that had forced her to leave the gala early. "The passage," James whispered. "It's our only way out without being seen." They slipped into Isabel's study and quickly opened the hidden bookshelf entrance. As they squeezed into the narrow passage, Alexander could hear Isabel entering her apartments, speaking to her staff about preparing a hot tea for her headache. They made their way through the passage in darkness, not daring to use flashlights that might be visible from either end. When they finally emerged in the East Wing basement, both men were breathing hard from tension and exertion. "That was too close," James muttered, "but we got what we needed," Alexander replied, thinking of the safety deposit box key and the photograph of Isabel on his mother's horse. "Tomorrow, I'm calling my legal team. I want access to that safety deposit box by the end of the week." The next morning brought another revelation that shook Alexander's understanding of recent events. During breakfast, Isabel mentioned casually that she had been thinking about making some changes to her will. "Now that I'm getting older," she said, spreading marmalade on her toast, "I want to ensure that my affairs are properly arranged. I've been thinking about establishing a charitable foundation, perhaps something in memory of your dear mother." The mention of his mother made Alexander's skin crawl, but he forced himself to respond normally. "That's very thoughtful of you, Isabel. Yes, I've been going through some old papers and photographs lately, remembering the early days after your father and I married. Your mother left such a legacy of kindness and grace. It seems fitting to honor that." Alexander realized with growing horror that Isabel was describing her recent activities in the hidden passage as innocent nostalgia. She was that confident in her deception, that secure in her belief that no one would ever discover the truth. "What sort of foundation did you have in mind?" he asked. "Something related to equestrian safety, perhaps? Your mother's accident was such a tragedy, but it highlighted how dangerous riding can be, even for experienced riders. If we could prevent other families from suffering such losses," the audacity of it left Alexander speechless. Here was the woman who had likely murdered his mother, proposing to create a foundation in her memory, ostensibly to prevent the very type of accident she had orchestrated. That afternoon, Alexander met with his senior legal advisor, Sir Robert Chamberlain, who had served the royal family for over 30 years. Sir Robert was one of the few people who could be trusted with sensitive matters involving the royal family's private affairs. "I need your help with a delicate matter, Robert," Alexander began carefully. "I have reason to believe that documents related to my mother's death may have been improperly removed from the royal archives. I need a court order to examine a private safety deposit box that may contain these documents." Sir Robert frowned deeply. "That's a very serious allegation, Your Highness. Do you have evidence of this theft?" Alexander had prepared for this question. "I have security footage showing unauthorized access to the archive areas, and inventory records showing that specific documents are missing. I cannot provide more details at this time, but I assure you this is a matter of the highest importance. If you're suggesting that someone has been stealing documents related to the late Queen's death, the implications are... Such actions would constitute not just theft, but potentially obstruction of justice if there were any irregularities in the original investigation. Precisely why I need access to that safety deposit box. If stolen documents are being hidden there, we need to recover them before they can be destroyed." Sir Robert was quiet for a long moment, considering the legal and political ramifications. "I can obtain the court order, Your Highness, but I must warn you, if this leads where I think it might be leading, it will create a scandal that could rock the very foundations of the monarchy. The truth is more important than avoiding scandal, Robert. Whatever the cost, I need to know what really happened to my mother." 2 days later, armed with a court order and accompanied by Sir Robert and Captain Morrison, Alexander stood outside the First National Bank of Edinburgh. The bank manager, clearly nervous about having royal representatives examining a customer's private property, led them to the safety deposit box room. Box 347 was larger than Alexander had expected, big enough to hold documents, photographs, and small objects. When it was opened, the contents made Alexander's blood run cold. Inside were the missing documents from the royal archives, the police reports, witness statements, and medical examiner's findings from his mother's death. But there were also things that had never been in the official investigation. Photographs of his mother's horse taken shortly before her death, showing small marks on the animal's flanks that looked like injection sites. A veterinary syringe. A small vial that had once contained something labeled only with a chemical formula. Most damning of all was his mother's diary. Its final entry dated the morning of her death. "I've been having the strangest dreams lately, and Duchess has been acting oddly during our rides. Yesterday she seemed almost drugged, responding slowly to commands and stumbling occasionally. I've asked the stable master to have the veterinarian examine her, but he says Dr. Brennan already looked at her and found nothing wrong." Strange that Isabel's late husband was apparently a veterinarian. She never mentioned that before. I should probably speak to Alexander about my concerns, but I don't want to worry him unnecessarily. Still, something feels wrong. If anything happens to me, I hope someone will look more carefully at. The entry ended there, the pen trailing off mid-sentence as if Queen Arabella had been interrupted. Alexander's hands shook as he read his mother's final words. She had suspected something was wrong, had noticed that her horse was being drugged, but she hadn't realized the full extent of the danger she was in. "Sir Robert," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want Isabel arrested immediately. We have evidence of theft, conspiracy, and murder. Your Highness, while this evidence is certainly compelling, we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Arresting the Queen Mother on murder charges will require absolute certainty and ironclad legal procedures." James, who had been photographing the contents of the safety deposit box, looked up from the chemical vial. "Sir, I think this contains traces of a sedative compound. If someone had been systematically drugging the horse to make it sluggish and unresponsive, then suddenly stopped the drug on the day of the ride, the animal would have become hyperactive, unpredictable. A perfect way to cause an accident," Alexander said grimly. "Isabel used her late husband's veterinary knowledge to drug my mother's horse for weeks, conditioning it to expect the sedative. Then, on the morning of the ride, she withheld the drug, knowing the horse would be agitated and dangerous." Sir Robert was examining the photographs and documents with growing alarm. "Your Highness, if this evidence is authentic, and it appears to be, then we're looking at one of the most sophisticated murder plots in modern history. The planning, the patience required, the intimate knowledge of both horses and human psychology. She fooled everyone for 20 years, Alexander said. She comforted my father in his grief, helped raise me, played the role of the perfect stepmother, all while knowing she had murdered my mother in cold blood. The drive back to the palace was conducted in grim silence." Alexander stared out the window at the Scottish countryside, remembering countless conversations with Isabel over the years. She had often spoken fondly of his mother, sharing stories and memories that had seemed to bring comfort. Now he realized that every word had been a calculated performance, designed to maintain her facade of innocence. When they arrived at the palace, Sir Robert immediately began coordinating with law enforcement and the Crown Prosecution Service. The arrest of the Queen Mother would require careful planning and absolute discretion until the moment it happened. "Where is she now?" Alexander asked James. "In the garden, sir. She's having tea with the Duchess of Marlborough, who's visiting for the afternoon." Alexander looked out the window and saw Isabel sitting elegantly at a small table on the terrace, entertaining her guest with animated conversation. She looked completely relaxed, utterly innocent. It was a masterful performance by someone who had been playing a role for 20 years. "Sir," James said quietly, "there's something else you should know. While we were at the bank, I had the team analyze the horse photographs more carefully. Those injection marks on your mother's horse? They're in exactly the same locations where we found similar marks on Count Victor Brennan's hunting horse after his accident." Alexander felt a wave of nausea. "She's done this before. She perfected the technique on her first husband's horse, then used it on my mother. It appears so, sir. And if she was willing to murder twice for money and position, Alexander didn't let him finish the thought. The implications were too terrible to contemplate. How many other deaths might Isabel have been responsible for? How many other families had suffered while she climbed the social ladder with blood on her hands? "James, I want you to increase security around the palace immediately. If Isabel realizes we're onto her, she might try to flee. Or worse, she might try to eliminate witnesses." "Already in progress, sir. I've stationed additional guards at all exits and implemented discreet surveillance on Queen Mother Isabel's activities." As evening approached, Alexander prepared himself for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of his life. He had to confront Isabel with the evidence, had to look into the eyes of the woman who had murdered his mother and pretended to care for him, had to somehow find the strength to face 20 years of lies and manipulation. The arrest would happen tomorrow, but tonight, he wanted answers. He wanted to know why. He wanted to understand how someone could be so evil, so calculating, so utterly without conscience. Most of all, he wanted to hear her admit what she had done, because after 20 years of grieving for an accident that was actually murder, after 20 years of loving a stepmother who was actually his mother's killer, Alexander finally had the power to bring justice for Queen Arabella, and he intended to use it. The grandfather clock in the main hall struck 9 as Alexander made his way to Queen Mother Isabel's private sitting room. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. In his jacket pocket, he carried copies of the most damning evidence from the safety deposit box: his mother's diary, the photographs of the drugged horse, and the chemical analysis of the sedative compound. 20 years of lies were about to end tonight. Isabel was seated by the fireplace, reading a leather-bound book of poetry. She looked up with her customary warm smile as Alexander entered, but something in his expression made her carefully mark her page and set the book aside. "Alexander, dear," she said, rising gracefully from her chair. "You look troubled. Is everything all right?" For a moment, Alexander almost faltered. This woman had been a constant presence in his life for 2 decades. She had helped him through adolescence, celebrated his achievements, offered comfort during difficult times. The maternal warmth in her voice was so perfectly genuine that it was hard to believe she was capable of murder. But then he remembered his mother's final diary entry, the fear and confusion in those last written words, and his resolve hardened like steel. "Actually, Isabel, there are some things we need to discuss. Please sit down." Something in his tone made her pause. For just a fraction of a second, Alexander saw a flicker of wariness in her eyes before the composed mask settled back into place. "Of course," she said, retaking her seat with elegant precision. "What's on your mind?" Alexander remained standing, unconsciously taking a position that allowed him to block her access to the door. "I've been learning some interesting things about the palace's history lately. Did you know there are hidden passages throughout the building?" "I had heard rumors of such things," Isabel replied carefully. "These old buildings often have architectural curiosities." "Yes, curiosities. We found one recently that connects the East Wing basement to this very room. Fascinating engineering, really. Someone went to considerable trouble to keep that passage functional and secret." Now there was no mistaking the tension in Isabel's posture. Her hands folded in her lap had tightened into fists. "How interesting," she said, her voice perfectly controlled. "I imagine such passages were used during times of war for quick escapes, or for secret access to areas where someone wasn't supposed to be." Alexander pulled out his phone and showed her a still frame from the security footage. "Like the Royal Archives, where documents related to my mother's death were stored." Isabel looked at the image of herself emerging from the hidden passage. For a long moment, the room was completely silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant ticking of clocks. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. The warm maternal tone was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "I suppose there's no point in pretending anymore," she said. "How much do you know?" The casual admission hit Alexander like a physical blow. Even though he had been certain of her guilt, hearing her acknowledge it so matter-of-factly was shocking. "I know everything," he said. "The drugs you used on my mother's horse, the safety deposit box where you've been hiding the evidence, the fact that you used the same technique to kill your first husband." Isabel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Everything? Oh, my dear boy, you know so very little." She rose from her chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens with her back to Alexander. In the firelight, her shadow stretched across the room like a dark omen. "You think this started with Victor, don't you? My poor, gullible first husband with his hunting accidents and his convenient will. But you're wrong, Alexander. This started long before Victor. This started with your mother." Alexander felt the room tilt slightly. "What do you mean?" Isabel turned back to face him, and in the flickering light,
Her beautiful face looked almost demonic. "I mean that I didn't marry your father because Victor died. Victor died because I needed to marry your father. Because I needed to get close to your mother." The implications crashed over Alexander like a wave. "You're saying you targeted my family specifically. I'm saying that your mother was always the prize, darling. Everything else was just preparation." Isabel moved to a side table and poured herself a glass of brandy with steady hands. "You want to know the truth? The whole truth? Very well. But I warn you, it's not the simple story of greed and ambition you've constructed in your mind." Alexander remained silent, afraid that any interruption might stop her confession. "I first saw your mother 25 years ago at a charity polo match. She was radiant, beloved, everything a queen should be. But more than that, she was happy. Genuinely. Completely happy with her perfect life, her perfect husband, her perfect son." Isabel's voice carried a venom that made Alexander's skin crawl. "Do you know what it's like, Alexander? To see someone who has everything you've ever wanted, handed to them simply by accident of birth? So you decided to destroy her?"
"I decided to take what should have been mine." Isabel sipped her brandy, her eyes distant with memory.
"It took me 3 years to plan. First, I had to acquire the necessary skills and knowledge. I married Victor specifically because he was a veterinarian. I needed to learn about animal behavior and sedatives. Poor Victor thought he was getting a loving wife, but he was actually training his own murderer." The clinical detachment in her voice was terrifying. Alexander realized he was in the presence of someone who was not merely evil, but completely without conscience or empathy. "After Victor's convenient accident, I had money, social standing, and the veterinary knowledge I needed. It took me another year to arrange an introduction to your father. Grief makes people vulnerable, and your father was devastated by your mother's loss. All I had to do was be patient, be sympathetic, be everything he needed in his pain. But my mother wasn't dead yet when you met my father." "No." Isabel smiled coldly. "She wasn't, but I knew she would be soon." Alexander felt sick. "You planned her murder while you were comforting my father?" "I planned her murder while I was studying her routines, her habits, her beloved horse." "Your mother was remarkably predictable, Alexander. Every morning at 8 o'clock, she would ride the same path through the woods. Always alone, because she valued that time for reflection. It was pathetically easy to arrange an accident." Isabel moved closer to Alexander, and he could see something alien and predatory in her eyes. This was not the woman who had raised him. This was something wearing her face, something that had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. The drugs were the key, of course. For 6 weeks before her death, I injected tiny amounts of sedative into Duchess every few days. Just enough to make the horse slightly sluggish, slightly unresponsive. Your mother noticed, but she attributed it to age or minor illness. The stable staff never suspected anything because the symptoms were so subtle. And then, on the morning she died, on that morning, instead of a sedative, I gave Duchess a stimulant, a powerful one that would take effect approximately 30 minutes after injection. Your mother began her ride with a calm horse, but halfway through her usual path, Duchess became hyperactive, agitated, and unpredictable. In an area where the path curved sharply, near several large trees. Alexander's hands were shaking with rage. "You murdered her in cold blood." "I executed a flawless plan," Isabel corrected. "Your mother's death looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a tragic riding accident. The police investigation found nothing suspicious because there was nothing suspicious to find. The horse had no drugs in its system by the time it was examined, because stimulants metabolize much faster than sedatives. But you kept evidence. The syringe, the photographs, the drug vials. Why?" For the first time, Isabel looked slightly uncertain. "Insurance, initially. In case anyone became suspicious, I wanted to be able to plant evidence that would point to someone else, perhaps a disgruntled stable hand or a jealous rival. But as the years passed and no one questioned the accident, they became souvenirs. Souvenirs of murder. Souvenirs of victory." Isabel's voice hardened again. "I won, Alexander. I got everything I wanted. Your father's love, the title of Queen Mother,
respect and admiration from the entire kingdom. I became everything your mother had been, and more. Alexander pulled out his mother's diary and held it up. My mother suspected you. Her final entry shows she knew something was wrong. Isabel's composure cracked slightly. Let me see that. She wrote about the horse acting strangely. She mentioned your first husband being a veterinarian, something you had never told her. She was going to investigate further. Give me that diary, Alexander. She knew you were going to kill her, didn't she? Maybe not consciously, but some part of her understood the danger. Isabel lunged for the diary, but Alexander stepped back, keeping it out of her reach. The movement brought him closer to the fireplace, and he saw something that made his blood freeze. There, among the fireplace tools, was a brass letter opener, the same type of antique blade that had been used to kill Count Victor Brennan, according to the police report James had uncovered. Isabel followed his gaze and smiled. You're a clever boy, Alexander. Yes, that's the same type of weapon I used on Victor. I kept it as a reminder of my first success, but also because she moved toward the fireplace with predatory grace. Well, sometimes the old methods are the most reliable. Alexander realized with growing horror that Isabel hadn't confessed because she felt guilty or defeated. She had confessed because she had no intention of letting him leave this room alive. You're planning to kill me too. I'm planning to survive, Isabel said, her hand closing around the letter opener. You've discovered my secrets, Alexander, but you haven't thought through the implications. If I'm arrested for murdering your mother, the entire monarchy will be destabilized. The scandal will destroy the institution your family has protected for centuries. The truth is more important than protecting the monarchy. The truth is that I've been a better queen mother than your real mother ever was. I've served this kingdom faithfully for 20 years. I've helped you become the man you are today. Does it really matter how that came about? Alexander stared at her in disbelief. You murdered my mother. You destroyed my father with grief. You've been living a lie for 20 years. I've been living a life I earned through intelligence and determination, Isabel shot back. Your mother was given everything she had through pure luck of birth. She never worked for anything, never sacrificed for anything, never proved she deserved the position she held. So you decided you deserved it more. I decided I was better suited for it, and I was right. Isabel raised the letter opener, its blade catching the firelight. I won't let you destroy everything I've built, Alexander. You're my stepson, and I do care for you in my way, but I care more about my own survival. Alexander's hand moved to his jacket pocket, where he had hidden a small recording device. James had insisted he wear it for this confrontation, and now Alexander was grateful for his security chief's paranoia. Everything Isabel had confessed was being recorded. It's too late, Isabel. Even if you kill me, the evidence has already been turned over to the authorities. James knows everything. Sir Robert knows everything. Killing me won't save you. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in Isabel's eyes. Then her expression hardened into something implacable and terrifying. Perhaps not, she said, but it will satisfy 20 years of having to pretend to love the son of the woman I murdered. She moved toward Alexander with the letter opener raised, but at that moment the door burst open. Captain Morrison and 3 palace guards rushed into the room, having heard the confrontation through the listening device. Stop! James shouted, his weapon drawn. Drop the blade, Your Majesty! Isabel turned toward the guards, and for a moment, Alexander thought she might surrender. Instead, she laughed again, that same chilling sound, like breaking glass. Your Majesty, she repeated. Yes, I am Your Majesty. I earned that title through blood and determination. I won't give it up to anyone. Before anyone could stop her, Isabel turned the letter opener on herself, driving it deep into her own chest. She collapsed beside the fireplace, blood spreading across her elegant evening gown. Alexander knelt beside her, instinctively trying to help, despite everything she had done. Isabel, why? Why did it have to end this way? She looked up at him with eyes that were growing dim, but still filled with defiant pride. Because, she whispered, her voice barely audible, I would rather die as a queen than live as a prisoner. Queen Mother Isabel died as the palace doctor arrived, taking her secrets and her unrepentant evil with her to the grave. In the days that followed, the kingdom reeled from the revelations about Queen Arabella's murder. The evidence from the safety deposit box combined with Isabel's recorded confession left no doubt about her guilt. But Alexander insisted that the full truth be revealed to the people, regardless of the scandal it would cause. The funeral for Queen Mother Isabel was a stark, private affair, attended only by immediate family and senior palace staff. There were no crowds of mourners, no state honors for a woman who had murdered her way to the throne. Her grave was unmarked, her name removed from the official royal records. Queen Arabella's remains were exhumed and given a new funeral service, this one befitting a murdered queen whose death had been hidden behind 20 years of lies. The entire kingdom mourned for her again, but this time with the full knowledge of the evil that had taken her from them. Alexander stood in the gardens where his mother had loved to walk, holding her diary and reading her final words again. The investigation had revealed even more evidence of Isabel's careful planning. Medical records showing she had been treating herself with hormones to ensure she could not get pregnant, ensuring that any children would be Alexander's alone. Even her love for his father had been calculated, designed to secure her position without creating rival heirs.
Sir, James approached quietly, there's something else you should know. We've been investigating Isabel's background more thoroughly, going back to her childhood.
Her real name wasn't Isabel Montclair. It was Isabella Morse, and she was born in a workhouse in Liverpool to an unwed mother who died in childbirth.
Alexander looked up from the diary. She reinvented herself completely.
Multiple times, sir. Isabella Morse became Isabel Bradford when she married a minor nobleman at age 19. He died in a carriage accident 6 months later, leaving her his modest estate. Isabel Bradford became Isabel Montclair when she married a wealthy merchant who died of food poisoning after 2 years of marriage. She inherited his fortune and social connections. Then Isabel Montclair became Isabel Brennan when she married Count Victor. Each marriage took her higher up the social ladder, and each husband died under circumstances that could be explained as accidents. We think she may have killed as many as 5 people before she targeted your mother. Alexander felt a mixture of horror and relief. Horror at the scope of Isabel's crimes, but relief that her reign of terror was finally over. What about the horse? Duchess? She lived for many years after your mother's death, sir. The stable records show she was retired to a peaceful life in the countryside. Interestingly, after your mother's death, Duchess never allowed Isabel to ride her again. Animals sometimes know things about people that humans miss. Alexander smiled sadly. Even his mother's horse had sensed the evil in the woman who had murdered her beloved rider. As the sun set over the palace gardens, Alexander made a decision. The truth about his mother's death would be preserved in the royal archives, but more importantly, it would be told to future generations. Evil had hidden in the shadows of Ravenshollow Palace for 20 years, but it would never be allowed to do so again. The monarchy would survive this scandal, as it had survived many others throughout history. But it would survive with a renewed commitment to truth and transparency, ensuring that no one could ever again use royal trust and tradition to hide such monstrous crimes. Queen Arabella's memory was finally free from the lies that had surrounded her death. And Prince Alexander, no longer haunted by unanswered questions, could begin the work of healing his kingdom and his own wounded heart. The palace shadows had been dispelled at last, and in their place came the clear light of justice and truth.